Peru's President Pedro Castillo impeached and detained. Argentina's Vice President Cristina Kirchner convicted of corruption. What's behind this wave of investigation and criminal charges at the highest echelons of power in Latin America? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the program. I'm Nastasia Tay. Now, a week ago, he was sitting at his presidential desk. Now, Peru's former leader, Pedro Castillo, sits in a prison cell. Impeached by the same Congress that he tried to dismiss, he faces charges of rebellion. Earlier criminal investigations also continue. Now, his removal came the same week as Argentina's Vice President, Cristina Kirchner, was convicted of corruption. The former president's immunity keeps her out of jail, but unless she wins any appeal, her political career could be over. All this just weeks after Brazil elected Lula De Silva president for a second term. It's a dramatic reversal after 18 months in jail for corruption before his conviction was annulled. So why have several current leftist leaders in Latin America been under investigation? We'll put that to our guests in just a moment. But first, this report from Mariana Sanchez in Lima on Castillo's downfall.
Marching for their former leader, supporters of Pedro Castillo gathered outside the prison where he's being held. From the heart of the capital city to the south of the country, supporters say they want him freed. Peru's latest political crisis unfolded on Wednesday when Castillo was impeached by Congress. When he left the presidential palace, the order to arrest him had already been issued. He was on his way to the Mexican embassy to seek asylum, but Castillo's own escorts were instructed to detain him at gunpoint. He was flown to this prison on the outskirts of the capital, where he'll stay for at least the next 7 days as an investigation into allegations of rebellion and conspiracy gets underway. His lawyer has rejected the charges and says Castillo's detention is illegal. Outside, angry supporters blamed the new president, Dina Boluarte, for Castillo's downfall.
Until a month ago, she was saying that if they unseated Castillo, they would go with him. Now she takes over the presidency and says she doesn't agree with a coup d'etat.
Boluarte is Peru's 6th president in 5 years and the first woman to lead the nation. On her first full day in office, she appealed for a political truce, but refused to rule out the possibility of early elections.
Some voices are calling to have early elections, and that is democratically respectable. I think that after the assumption of the presidency, it's time for a bit of a reorientation of what needs to be done with the country.
Opinion polls say 87% of Peruvians want fresh elections, frustrated by years of political turmoil. Most of Peru's former leaders are being investigated for some form of alleged corruption. Castillo is being held at the same prison as former President Alberto Fujimori.
Pedro Castillo and Alberto Fujimori, who is serving a 25-year sentence for human rights abuses. They are the only two former presidents of Peru who closed Congress illegally.
Dina Boluarte wants to bring an end to the political feuding which has paralyzed the country for years. As she chooses those who will be in her cabinet, she wants to show poor Peruvians they will not be forgotten. Mariana Sanchez, Al Jazeera, Lima, Peru.
Well, further south on the continent, Argentina's Vice President, Cristina de Kirchner, was sentenced to 6 years in prison, convicted of $1 billion fraud. Teresa Bo has more now from Buenos Aires.
These are supporters of Cristina de Kirchner, who came to the federal court building in Buenos Aires to protest against Argentina's judiciary. Kirchner was sentenced to 6 years in prison and given a lifetime ban on holding public office after being found guilty of corruption. It's the first time an Argentinian vice president has been convicted of a crime whilst in office. 3 months ago, Kirchner was the target of an assassination attempt when a man pulled the trigger of his handgun inches from her face as she greeted supporters. The gun failed to fire. Kirchner is accused of directing millions of dollars of public works contracts to a family friend. The former president denies all charges, accusing the tribunal in charge of a political witch hunt and serving the interests of the opposition.
This is much simpler. It's not lawfare. It's not a judiciary party. It's not a parallel state and mafia. It's a judicial mafia.
Cristina Fernández de Kirchner was Argentina's president for 8 years, between 2007 and 2015. She's now this country's vice president. She's a divisive figure in this country. While there are many who continue to support her, there are many others who would like to see her in prison.
Kirchner is expected to appeal against the court's decision. Despite her conviction, she has congressional immunity and is unlikely to head to jail anytime soon.
Well, let's now bring in our guests. In London, we have Javier Farge. He is a journalist and also an analyst on Latin American affairs. In Buenos Aires, we have Sebastian Lacunza. He is a senior reporter for Red Intelligence Latin America and a former editor of the Buenos Aires Herald. And in Managua, Nicaragua, Ben Norton, an investigative journalist and also the founder and editor of Multipolarista, an independent news website that's based in Latin America. A warm welcome to each of you. Thank you for joining us on Inside Story, gentlemen. There's obviously been a lot that's happened in Latin America in just the last few days, plenty to unpick. So I want to start in Peru. Pedro Castillo has obviously made some decisions that have lost him lots of allies, landed him in prison, but I do want to take a bit of a step back and have a look at the corruption allegations against him. He says that they're politically motivated. Javier, is that fair?
Well, it's very difficult to determine that because in Latin America, in Peru anyway, the border between the legal issues and political issues is very, very blurry. In the case of Mr. Castillo's accusations, I had the chance to read the whole indictment by the Attorney General, and although the Attorney General provides evidence that members of his inner circle were involved in corruption, there is no direct link between them and President Castillo, which is a very of a tricky issue. In fact, many jurists and many specialists on legal issues in Peru say that it would be very difficult for that to stand up in court because the only reason why the Attorney General linked Mr. Castillo to these cases is because these people were part of his inner circle, relatives, friends, and all that. But there's no direct link. There's no evidence that it's a direct link. I'm not saying that there isn't a link. It's said that there's no evidence, legal evidence, that there is a direct link between President Castillo and the corrupt people who are being indicted. He's being accused of being the head of a criminal enterprise, but the Attorney General did not provide enough evidence to link him directly with this case of corruption. Many people accuse him of being neglectful, of being careless, of not looking after the interests of the presidency. But the link is very, very fragile, and it would have been very difficult to prove in court unless he provides, and they provide concrete evidence that he was directly involved, he directly benefited, promoted, or encouraged this kind of acts of corruption.
Okay, well then turning to Argentina, we've obviously heard some similar accusations from Cristina Kirchner. She says that part of the case against her is an attack by a parallel mafia state. Sebastian, who is she talking about?
Well, the case is related to a tycoon who used to be a close friend of the late President Néstor Kirchner, Cristina Kirchner's late husband, who became an entrepreneur, a contractor of public works in the province of Santa Cruz, in the very south of Patagonia, when the Kirchners moved to Buenos Aires when Néstor was elected president. So there is certain ground, at least, to investigate why this person, who ended up having millions, dozens of millions of dollars in bank accounts in Switzerland, for instance. At the same time, the prosecutor didn't find clear evidence of a connection between the fortune of this tycoon, this magnate, and Cristina Fernández de Kirchner and her family. Cristina said that she is being victim of a judicial mafia. Well, it is a political allegation, but there are maybe there are reasons to think that there is a connection abroad between leaders of the opposition party, Conservative Alliance, Juntos por el Cambio, the judiciary, spies, and the Grupo Clarín, which is the main media group in Argentina.
So there's a bit of speculation there, Sebastian. I know, Ben, you've done some digging into this. I want to understand how what Kirchner is alleging could actually be possible. Surely this is a strength of the question of institutions, of not only the strength of them, but their integrity as well.
Well, we need to understand that Argentina, until very recently in the 1980s, was a dictatorship. There were no democratic institutions until really 1983. And many of those institutions are very weak. And the judicial system is an example of this. And it is weaponized by the political opposition. In fact, since 2004, there have been 654 judicial cases filed, almost all of them frivolous, against Cristina Kirchner by the right-wing opposition. In fact, 6 individuals, just those individuals, have filed between 20 and 74 lawsuits against her. So what we see is a constant concerted political attack using the judicial system against her as a weapon. It's called lawfare, legal warfare. And we also have leaked messages and photos and videos showing that prosecutors and judges were conspiring with the right-wing opposition and with large media corporations like the Grupo Clarín, which is the main kind of conservative media outlet like Fox News in Argentina, which supports the right-wing former president, Mauricio Macri. There are photos showing some of the prosecutors in an airport meeting with members of this company. When she says that there is a parallel mafia state that's not elected, I mean, that's not wrong. I mean, the reality is we have evidence showing that these compromised prosecutors were directly collaborating with the opposition and flying on their planes and going to their mansions.
Well, I want to take this moment to talk a little bit more about institutions, the weakness and the strength of them, because as he tried to dissolve Congress, I recall Castillo was accusing parliamentarians of, what was it, destroying the rule of law and trying to establish a congressional dictatorship. I mean, some might argue that a congressional dictatorship led by elected officials is a form of democracy, right? I want to take a look at a graphic, because I believe Peru has had, 10 presidents now in the last 2 decades? Now, 2 were just short-term temporary interim office holders, but the other 8 were either ousted, jailed, or detained. One of them died via suicide. 10 presidents in 2 decades, and 4 in just the last 2 years? That instability, that level of instability, Javier, how has that contributed to the situation that we're facing now?
Oh, the political system in Peru is broken. There's no question about that. You have mentioned all the presidents who have been indicted. One of them is waiting to be extradited to Peru, Alejandro Toledo. Alan Garcia committed suicide. All the presidents are under house arrest. In the case of Mr. Castillo, the announcement he made on Wednesday, the 7th of December, took everybody by surprise. According to the Constitution, he cannot close down Congress by himself. He cannot do that. That violated an article of the Constitution that banned him from doing that. That's the first thing. Second, when Congress the day before, he was still discussing his defense against attempts to impeach him in Congress. The opposition in Congress had managed to get enough votes to debate the issue, but not to sack him. They didn't have enough votes for that. He would have probably survived that vote. On Tuesday evening, he announced that he was going to go to Congress to defend himself. On Wednesday midday, he announced that he was closing Congress, that he was ordering the reorganization of the judiciary, which he is not allowed to do that, and also the Constitutional Tribunal. And that got everyone by surprise. All his ministers resigned, and the armed forces. And in any country in Latin America, you cannot conduct a coup without the support of the armed forces. And now, after the announcement was made, the armed forces said that they would not support this because this was unconstitutional. And of course, at the end, after this announcement, the opposition managed to get enough votes to indict and to impeach the president.
So, Javier, sorry to interrupt, but I mean, this sounds to me like a real triumph of institutions. It shows the strength of the Constitution and the process. Ben, I'm curious. I want to throw this to you because I see that Mexico is standing by Castillo and they're considering offering him asylum. The president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, described this as a soft coup. Is this, Ben, leftist solidarity, or is Obrador potentially concerned that something similar could happen to him?
Well, it certainly was a congressional coup. I mean, it's true that what Castillo did in dissolving the Congress was legally in a gray area, although in the Constitution, which we can talk about in a second, which is deeply compromised, and he wanted to change the Constitution to prevent these kinds of coups in the future. But it does provide the possibility for the president to dissolve Congress in certain cases of obstructionism. And the Congress in Peru the perfect description is obstructionist. It has taken every single step since day one to prevent Castillo, the elected president, from being able to govern. That's why there have been 6 presidents in 5 years, because there's an article in the Constitution that goes back to the Fujimori dictatorship, which ended in 2000. Let's not forget, Peru had a far-right dictatorship until 2000, and Fujimori committed genocide. He sterilized indigenous women, and his children are prominent politicians in the opposition. His daughter came close to becoming president, Keiko Fujimori. The point is that he left behind this dictatorial constitution that allows the Congress to remove an elected president with a majority vote if the president is deemed to have moral incapacity. That means nothing. I mean, basically, it opens the possibility for the political opposition to constantly try to launch a legal coup against the president. And yes, you could say that it was a very unwise move for Castillo to dissolve the Congress, but the reality is that this was the 3rd time in just over a year that the Congress was trying to overthrow him, and he was tired of the obstructionism, so he dissolved it. And let's not forget that the Congress, according to the latest poll from a few weeks ago, has 11% approval in Peru. So these are undemocratic actions taken by a very vicious right-wing opposition, and that includes the daughter and the son of the former far-right dictator.
Okay, so taking a bit of a step back here, we're talking about 2 countries with leftist leadership in a region that's notoriously plagued by corruption, I think we can all agree, population struggling with vast inequality, deep disillusionment with public officials. These kinds of narratives that we're hearing aren't just confined to Peru and Argentina. We've also seen this big shift towards the left in Latin America. This coming January, I was having a look at the numbers. For the first time, I believe, all of the 7 most populous countries will have left-of-center governments. It feels like the public have also a real preference for big personalities, kind of outside of figures. Now, given the rise in populism across the region, Sebastian, do you think that it makes these kinds of attacks on individuals specifically more effective?
It is difficult to tackle this issue, speaking as Latin America as a whole, as countries or the political environment of our countries are very different from Peru and from Argentina, for instance. Cristina Kirchner has been a decisive figure in Argentine politics, as your reporter in Buenos Aires said, and she is still supported by about 1/3 of the population. Her approval ratings are pretty stable despite all the storms she has faced in the last decade. So she is still a competitive leader. 1/3 of population, of citizens, would vote for her. Her influence in the parents' left-leaning front alliance coalition is decisive. So this is an ongoing situation. Many in Argentina look at Brazil and Luis Inacio Lula Da Silva, who expressed his support to Cristina, as Cristina and President Alberto Fernandez have backed Lula during the legal case he faced in Brazil, because there are similarities. So what Brazil says is that certainties are not allowed regarding politics.
Sure. Well, politics can go either way, and we've obviously seen both left and right-wing governments in power across Latin America over the last century and the last few decades. Both governments on the left and the right have been accused of corruption, and if you ask the left or the right who's more corrupt, they'll obviously say each other. So do you think then, Javier, let me throw this to you, is this an attack that we're seeing on the left, or is this simply cyclical power politics, that it just happens to be that there are a large number of leftist politicians in power at the moment and they're being attacked by the right?
Well, it depends very much on what country you're talking about here. In Peru, for example, when Mr. Castillo, who was elected on a left-wing ticket, when he became president, nobody knew exactly where he stood. That is one of the problems that he had, politically speaking. In fact, Dina Boluarte, the current president, the one who's just been appointed by Congress, is more to the left to Mr. Castillo than actually Mr. Castillo. In fact, Aníbal Torres, the prime minister until recently of Mr. Castillo's cabinet, once defended Hitler and Mussolini, which is not exactly something you would expect from somebody who comes from the left. So it became like a lack of total political identity. In relation to the political side of it, it is absolutely true, as our colleague said, that Parliament has been trying to put obstacles to Mr. Castillo, to government, and they tried to get rid of him. In fact, they wanted to accuse him of treason, which was a ridiculous accusation. However, when Mr. Castillo and the opposition never had enough votes to impeach him, when Mr. Castillo decided to close Congress, it gave ammunition to the opposition to get enough votes, because many people in Congress who would have been reluctant to impeach the president didn't have any choice but to vote in favor of the impeachment. So he gave the ammunition to the opposition to get rid of him. And of course, he was totally isolated. He didn't inform any of the members of his cabinet, apart from his prime minister. They were all caught by surprise. His lawyers were caught by surprise. He probably would have won the vote against impeachment. That is the irony of this situation. And then with his decision, he gave ammunition to those who wanted to get rid of him to get rid of him, which is exactly what's happened. So it is more than political. Javier, there was a strategy, and there were a lot of mistakes.
Sure. I'm going to stop you there, because I do want to take a moment to also look at what lies ahead. The main trend from recent elections, it seems, in Latin America has been anti-incumbency. An opponent has won the last, 16 free presidential contests in the region? So, Ben, do you think, very briefly, we should expect then to see a swing to the right in the coming months and years?
Well, it depends on the country. In Argentina, the situation is very difficult, especially economically, largely because the country is trapped in unpayable, odious debt owed to the International Monetary Fund. Ironically, that debt, which is $44 billion, was taken by the previous right-wing president, Mauricio Macri, but it has really trapped the current government, the center-left government of Alberto Fernandez and Cristina Kirchner. And it's very likely that in the 2023 elections that are coming up, especially considering that Cristina said in her speech after the sentence that she's not going to be running for president, it's likely the right wing is going to win in Argentina. And that is going to throw a wrench into the project of regional integration, because when Lula comes in Brazil on January 1st, he has said clearly that he wants to try to economically integrate Latin America, to bring back institutions like the UNASUR, the Bank of the South, creating a new currency. And it's very likely that in Argentina, the right is going to come back to power. So, I mean, it depends on the country that you're looking at, but certainly Argentina is one where I think the left's, their control of power is very limited.
Indeed, and it will be very interesting to see how the various corruption allegations aimed at various leaders across the region also play out in upcoming elections. We'll have to leave it there for today, though. Thank you to all of our guests, Javier Faje, Sebastian Lacunza, and Ben Norton. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And remember, you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasia Tay, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.